We're calling 911 about environmental destruction. My HOA president's voice rang out on day 3 of owning this abandoned lake. I stood there in muddy boots, watching Ava White explain to police why I'm a federal criminal. 3 days from my retirement dream to become a legal nightmare with environmental laws, federal statutes, and neighbor disputes that make you question every choice. But Ava didn't know about the rusty sign I'd just found. Comment if your HOA has ever made your life miserable. The sirens hit before my coffee did. 6:15 in the morning, and I'm standing knee-deep in marsh water that smells like 20 years of neglect. 3 days. That's how long I'd owned this property before becoming a suspected environmental criminal. The retirement dream was simple: buy a little lake, fix it up, maybe catch some fish. Instead, I'm watching a patrol car pull up to my new nightmare. Officer Harris stepped out first, followed by a woman I'd never met, but somehow knew was going to ruin my day. Tall, silver hair pulled back like she meant business, carrying a folder thick enough to stop bullets. This had to be Ava White, the HOA president my real estate agent had mentioned in passing. Mentioned being the operative word, like mentioning a hurricane as a little weather. Officer, this man is in direct violation of Clean Water Act Section 404. Ava announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had read actual law books. She flipped open that folder and started reading. Any discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States requires a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers under 33 U.S.C. 1344. I'm standing there dripping marsh water, and this woman is quoting federal statutes like she's arguing before the Supreme Court. It sounded right. It sounded official. It sounded like I was in deep trouble. Officer Harris looked at me, then at Ava, then at the muddy mess I'd been working in. Sir, what exactly were you doing out there? Honest question deserved an honest answer. I was clearing some debris from the inlet. Previous owner left it pretty rough, and I figured I'd start with the obvious stuff. Old tires, broken concrete, some kind of artificial dam that looked like... Artificial dam? Ava's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Officer, he's admitting to destroying wetland infrastructure without environmental impact assessment. This requires immediate intervention under NEPA guidelines. The officer held up his hand. Professional guy, probably dealt with neighbor disputes before breakfast more often than he'd like. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see documentation of any federal designations. Sir, I need you to step out of the water. This is when things got interesting. As I'm slogging back to shore, my boot kicks something half buried in the cattail reeds. Metal. Rectangular. Heavy enough to matter. I picked up what turned out to be a sign. Rusted, weathered, but still readable. U.S. Waterway, Federal Navigation Project, authorized 2003. The rest was too corroded to make out, but those words hit different. Federal, authorized, 2003. Ava went quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which in retrospect should have been my first clue that she wasn't quite as confident as she seemed. That sign is expired, she said quickly, too quickly. Federal designations require maintenance and renewal. Clearly this property has been abandoned by federal oversight. Officer Harris was writing in his notepad, but he looked up at that. Ma'am, I'm going to need both of you to work this out through proper channels. County Environmental Office opens at 8. If there are federal issues involved, they'll direct you to Army Corps or DEP. He handed me a civil dispute reference number and told Ava he'd be filing a report about the complaint. As the patrol car pulled away, Ava was already on her phone. I caught fragments. Yes, I need to file an emergency environmental violation, federal waterway, unauthorized modification. She looked at me like I'd personally poisoned every fish in the state. Mr. Lewis, this isn't over. I have 5 environmental attorneys on retainer, and they all specialize in Clean Water Act violations. You will restore this wetland to its original condition, or you will face federal prosecution. Then she was gone, leaving me standing there holding a piece of rusted metal that might or might not mean anything. The morning sun was climbing higher, turning the marsh mist into something almost beautiful. 3 days ago, this was going to be my peaceful retirement project. Now, it was a federal case, apparently. But here's the thing about that rusted sign. When I flipped it over to check the backside, there was something Ava hadn't seen. Something that made me think maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as informed about federal waterway law as she thought she was. The back of that sign had a series of numbers and what looked like coordinates. Faded but readable if you knew what you were looking for. I didn't know what I was looking for, not yet. But I knew somebody who might be quoting the wrong section of the wrong law, and I knew that when someone talks that fast about expired federal designations, they're usually trying to convince themselves as much as they're trying to convince you. 3 questions started forming in my head. The same 3 questions that would eventually save my property and teach me more about bureaucracy than any retirement hobby should require. Who authorized this? What's the actual scope? And where's the real paperwork? Standing there in my soaked boots, holding a mystery sign and facing down what sounded like a legal nightmare, I made a decision that probably saved everything. Instead of panicking, instead of calling lawyers, instead of assuming Ava White knew what she was talking about, I decided to find out exactly what that sign meant. Because if there's one thing 20 years in engineering taught me, it's that when someone's reading you specifications that sound too perfect, they probably don't understand the specs themselves. But when I flipped that sign over and saw what was on the back, well, let's just say Ava White didn't know everything she thought she knew about my little lake. The sun wasn't even thinking about coming up when I found myself surrounded by printed federal regulations, 3 highlighter colors, and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My dining room table looked like a legal brief had exploded. Stacks of paper marked with yellow, pink, and green highlights, sticky notes everywhere, and my laptop screen showing the Army Corps of Engineers website that I'd been staring at since midnight. That rusted sign wasn't giving up its secrets easily. 2003 authorization federal navigation project and those coordinates on the back that led to, well, that's where things got complicated. According to the USGS mapping system, those coordinates pointed to a seasonal waterway connection between my lake and the Willow River system. Seasonal being the key word, because apparently federal jurisdiction over navigation can depend on whether water actually flows through a channel during specific times of the year. Ava's letter had arrived by certified mail at exactly 8 a.m. Impressive timing that suggested she'd been up as late as I had, but probably with better legal resources. 5 pages of environmental code citations, each one more intimidating than the last. Clean Water Act, Section 404, National Environmental Policy Act. Requirements, state wetland protection statutes, and something called the Rivers and Harbors Act that I'd never heard of, but sounded seriously federal. She quoted 33 U.S.C. 1344 with the precision of someone who'd memorized it, referenced wetland delineation procedures, and demanded immediate cessation of all activities pending environmental impact assessment. It was good. It was thorough. It sounded absolutely correct. But there was something about the way she'd rushed past that sign yesterday, something about how quickly she'd called it expired, that made me want to dig deeper. So, instead of relying on a piece of rusted metal that might or might not mean anything, I decided to approach this like the engineering problem it was becoming. Step 1, establish actual jurisdiction. Step 2, determine current regulatory status. Step 3, document everything. The Army Corps website was a bureaucratic maze, but I'd navigated worse. After 2 hours of clicking through sections and subsections, I found the permit inquiry system. Simple form, property location, nature of work, waterway connection status. I filled it out honestly, purchased abandoned lake property, planning restoration work, discovered possible federal designation, son requesting current jurisdictional status. Hit submit at 3:17 a.m. and got an auto reply that made my heart rate spike. Thank you for your Section 10 permit inquiry. Your case has been assigned file number NAO 2024-00847. A preliminary review will be conducted within 10 business days. A soft thunk at the window made me freeze. Headlights bled across my blinds, then a phone flash. Someone was filming my shoreline from the road. I killed the lamp, lifted the blind with 2 fingers. Ava's crossover idled at the shoulder. A silhouette raised a phone toward my inlet. I snapped a time-stamped photo from my hallway pulse drumming. Fine. Research wouldn't be just PDFs. I needed eyes on the water at first light. Case number. They'd assigned me a case number. That meant this wasn't just some random property. It meant the Army Corps had systems in place for exactly this kind of inquiry. It meant federal jurisdiction was at least possible, maybe even probable. Relief hit first, then dread. A case number means rules, and rules mean I can break them. My stomach did the slow roll you get before a bad performance review. I made coffee I didn't drink. More importantly, it meant I had documentation that I was following proper procedures, asking the right questions, working through official channels instead of just clearing debris and hoping for the best. But I needed more than case numbers and auto replies. I needed proof that water actually connected this lake to federal navigable waters. That meant going back to the marsh at dawn with measuring equipment I didn't own to document water levels I didn't understand. Or it meant starting with the obvious stuff first. The staff gauge arrived from the county extension office that same morning. A simple measuring stick designed to track water levels over time. Professional installation would have cost hundreds. Doing it myself took about an hour and a YouTube video. The principle was simple: establish a benchmark. Install the gauge at a fixed point. Take daily readings, document seasonal flow patterns. If my lake connected to the Willow River during high water periods, the gauge would prove it. If it didn't, well then Ava might be right about federal jurisdiction being irrelevant. Installing that gauge felt like planting a flag. Not a defiant flag, not a come and take it flag, but a here's where we're going to establish some actual facts flag. Every engineering project needs a reference point, and this was mine. Whatever happened next would be measured against this moment, this location, this commitment to documenting reality instead of arguing about interpretations. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the cattails when I finished, and for the first time since Officer Harris drove away, I felt like I might actually know what I was doing. The gauge was set, the case number was assigned, and I had a plan that didn't involve lawyers or panic, or assuming that confident-sounding people necessarily knew what they were talking about. Tomorrow I'd start taking measurements. Next week, I'd follow up with the Army Corps, and hopefully before Ava's environmental attorneys started filing motions, I'd have some actual data to work with. But that night, as I was cleaning up the installation tools and getting ready to head inside, I checked my email one more time. The auto reply from the Army Corps was still there, but now there was something else. Something in the automatically generated case summary that I'd missed the first time, buried in the technical language and reference numbers. A detail that made me sit down hard on my porch steps and realize that maybe, just maybe, I'd stumbled into something bigger than a neighbor dispute. The case summary included a reference to previous permit applications for this property, previous applications, which meant other people had been down this road before, had asked these same questions, had dealt with these same jurisdictional issues. And if there were previous applications, there were previous decisions, previous determinations about federal authority navigation rights, and exactly what kind of waterway my little retirement lake actually was. Case number NAO 2024-00847 wasn't just my permit inquiry. It was the latest entry in what looked like a much longer conversation between various property owners and the federal government. A conversation that Ava White apparently didn't know about, or didn't want to know about, or was hoping I'd never discover. The auto reply had mentioned something about a preliminary determination being consistent with previous jurisdictional findings. Previous findings, which meant somewhere in the Army Corps files there was already an answer to the question of whether this property fell under federal authority. An answer that might make Ava's environmental code citations completely irrelevant. That detail in the auto reply, the part about previous jurisdictional findings, knocked the air out of my lungs for a second. Because if I was reading this right, if I understood what consistent with previous findings actually meant, then this whole dispute might already be settled. The federal government might have already decided years ago exactly what kind of waterway this was and exactly who had authority over it. And something told me Ava White wasn't going to like the answer. The community center was packed to tension already high before Ava started her presentation. Her slides framed my cleanup as unregulated development, complete with before and after photos that made me look like I'd drained a wetland. She'd taken those pictures from angles that emphasized every disturbed patch of mud, every moved piece of debris, every sign that someone had been working in the water. Professional quality photography, perfect lighting captions that used phrases like habitat destruction and wetland disruption. I had to admit it looked bad. This is what unregulated development does to sensitive ecosystems. Ava continued, her voice carrying just the right amount of environmental concern mixed with community protection. Mr. Lewis purchased this property 3 days ago and immediately began destroying wildlife habitat that has been undisturbed for decades. No permits, no environmental assessment, no consideration for the impact on our neighborhood's natural resources. Slide 2 showed what she called the artificial dam removal, which was actually me pulling out old tires and concrete blocks that somebody had dumped in the inlet channel. The presentation got worse from there. Slide 3 was about property values and how environmental violations could affect everyone's home equity. Slide 4 covered legal liability and how HOA members could be held responsible for contamination that spread beyond individual properties. Slide 5 was the killer, Federal Environmental Law and Community Responsibility, complete with quotes from the Clean Water Act that sounded absolutely damning when read out loud to a room full of nervous homeowners. Rebecca Clark raised her hand during the question period. Older lady lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone remembered when the lake was actually maintained by somebody official. I recall there being a federal sign down there years ago, she said, speaking carefully like someone who had been thinking about this. Sometime around 2019, maybe 2020, somebody came through and removed it. I always wondered about that because it seemed like government property. Ava's response was swift and confident. Mrs. Clark, federal designations require active maintenance and periodic renewal. Any sign that was removed was clearly expired or obsolete. The current status of this property is under state environmental jurisdiction, which requires strict adherence to wetland protection statutes. Mr. Lewis has violated those statutes. Mr. Lewis has violated those statutes. She clicked to slide 6, which showed the maximum penalties for Clean Water Act, violations, fines, up to $50,000 per day, criminal prosecution for willful violations, mandatory restoration costs that could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's when the room turned ugly. Not angry ugly, just disappointed ugly. The kind of quiet hostility you get when a whole community decides you're the problem. Jim Peterson, whose backyard borders my eastern property line, stood up and said what everyone was thinking. Look, Logan, we get that you want to fix the place up, but this is about all of us. If federal regulators come after you, they're going to investigate the whole neighborhood. Property values, insurance rates, future development permits, it affects everyone. The vote was 71 to 18 against me. 71 neighbors who wanted me to cease all lake activities until proper permits could be obtained. Environmental assessment completed and federal jurisdiction definitively ruled out. It landed like a door quietly locking. I smiled with my mouth and not my lungs counting breaths the way I did the night my dad's layoff got announced 5 in 5 out. Pretend calm until my hands stopped shaking. 18 people who thought I should be allowed to clear obvious trash from my own property. The motion passed with the kind of overwhelming majority that makes you realize how alone you really are. But here's what Ava White didn't know. What those 71 voters didn't know, what even I barely understood at the time. Federal bureaucracy works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the wheels of government turn faster than small-town politics. While Ava was preparing her slideshow, and Mrs. Clark was remembering old signs, the Army Corps of Engineers had been doing what they do best, processing paperwork with methodical efficiency. The call came during the final vote count. My phone buzzing in my pocket, while neighbors were publicly deciding that I was an environmental menace who needed to be controlled. By the time the recess bellied into the next docket call, I'd marked the pages that mattered. No parking lot epiphanies this round, just a stamped schedule and a federal contact sheet tucked behind my state case file. Danny Morrison had news. Good news, confusing news, and news that was going to change everything about my little property dispute. Sir, our preliminary review indicates seasonal navigable connection to the Willow River system during normal precipitation periods. We have previous determinations on file for this property dating back to 2003, and your current situation appears consistent with established federal jurisdiction. We'll need to schedule a site survey within 30 days to confirm current conditions. Federal jurisdiction, established federal jurisdiction, previous determinations dating back to 2003, the same year as that rusted sign I'd found in the cattails. Danny Morrison was telling me that the Army Corps already knew about my lake, had already made decisions about my lake, and those decisions apparently gave them authority over whatever work I wanted to do there. Standing in that parking lot listening to Danny explain survey procedures and permit requirements while 71 of my neighbors voted to shut down my retirement project, I realized something important. Ava White was right about federal environmental law being serious business. She was right about permits being required for waterway modifications. She was even right about penalties being severe for people who ignored the rules. But she was wrong about one crucial detail. She was wrong about who had authority to enforce those rules. The Clean Water Act that she'd quoted so confidently, the state environmental statutes that formed the backbone of her presentation, the wetland protection regulations that scared my neighbors into voting against me, all of that was absolutely real and absolutely binding. But it was binding on whoever had jurisdiction over the waterway, and if Danny Morrison was right, if the Army Corps had established federal jurisdiction over my property, then state environmental regulations weren't the issue. I walked back into that community center with my phone still warm from Danny Morrison's call and 71 votes already counted against me. The meeting was breaking up. People were folding chairs and gathering purses and giving me the kind of looks usually reserved for people who don't pick up after their dogs. Ava was packing up her laptop, looking satisfied with an evening's work well done. But they didn't know about the call. They didn't know about case number NAO 2024-00847 or previous determinations or scheduled site surveys. They didn't know that while they were voting to restrict my property rights based on state environmental law, the federal government was preparing to confirm that they had primary authority over the waterway in question. Dawn came gray and misty, perfect weather for what I was starting to think of as detective work. The logbook next to the gauge now held 3 days of readings graphed by time flat as a tabletop, useful as a baseline, not a headline, but that was only one piece of the puzzle. If I was going to prove seasonal connection to the Willow River, I needed to track the channel itself, lay out the grade with real elevations, and see how water actually chose its path between my lake and the broader system. The GoPro camera was Danny Morrison's suggestion. Document everything with GPS coordinates and timestamps, he'd said during our follow-up call. If we're going to confirm federal jurisdiction, we need current evidence of navigable connection. So, here I was at 6 a.m, strapping a camera to my chest and wading into marsh water that hadn't been properly mapped since the original survey in 2003. The inlet channel was more interesting than I'd expected. What looked like random cattail growth from the shore turned out to be a fairly well-defined waterway that snaked between higher ground toward the river system. Depth varied from 6 inches to nearly 3 feet, with a gravel bottom that suggested regular water flow during high precipitation periods. More importantly, the channel showed clear signs of recent water movement. Scoured banks deposited sediment vegetation patterns that indicated seasonal flooding. But there was something else, something that made me stop recording and really look at what I was seeing. The beaver dam that I'd started clearing on day 1, the pile of sticks and mud that had been blocking the channel, it wasn't exactly natural construction. The sticks were cut, not gnawed. The placement was too systematic, too engineered. And when I looked closer, some of those sticks had hardware attached. Screws, metal brackets, pieces of what looked like landscape lumber. I called the county environmental office from knee-deep water cameras still running. This is Logan Lewis, property tax ID 779946. I need to report what appears to be artificial obstruction of a waterway channel. The conversation that followed was probably the most bureaucratically satisfying phone call of my life. County Inspector Mike Torres would be out within 24 hours to document the obstruction, determine if it constituted illegal waterway modification, and file appropriate reports with state and federal agencies. Inspector Torres arrived the next morning with equipment that made my GoPro setup look amateur. Professional GPS unit water quality testing kit, photography equipment with macro lenses for detail work, and a clipboard thick with official forms. We spent 2 hours documenting every aspect of that artificial dam, from the cut lumber to the metal hardware to the deliberate placement across the natural flow channel. "This isn't beaver activity," Torres said, measuring the spacing between support posts. "Beavers don't use galvanized carriage bolts." He photographed each piece of evidence, recorded GPS coordinates for every major component, and filled out violation reports that would be filed with both state environmental agencies and the Army Corps. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This is engineered to block water flow during seasonal high periods. But the real breakthrough came 3 days later, buried in a stack of documents that arrived via my Freedom of Information Act request. HOA financial records, landscape service contracts, and maintenance invoices going back 5 years. Most of it was routine stuff, lawn care, snow removal, common area maintenance. But there on page 27 of invoices from Greenscape Solutions was something that stopped my pen mid-note. Seasonal Waterway Management, $2,847, dated September 15, 2023. The same date that Inspector Torres had determined for the artificial dam construction based on vegetation growth patterns and weathering of the lumber. Same date, same project documented in official HOA financial records as Waterway Management by a company that specialized in landscape modification. I spent the next hour cross-referencing invoice details with county records contractor licensing databases and environmental permit applications. Greenscape Solutions was legitimate, licensed for waterway modification work, bonded for environmental projects experienced with wetland construction, but they were also required to obtain permits for any work that affected natural water flow. And according to county records, no permits had been issued for waterway modification work on or near my property during 2023. The pattern was obvious now, a no-permit dam disguised as seasonal management built to cut the federal link, so state rules would dominate, and Ava's citations would stick. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the federal waterway status of my property. Someone had paid nearly $3,000 to a professional contractor to build an artificial obstruction designed to break the legal connection between my lake and federal navigable waters. And someone had documented the whole thing in official financial records that they apparently never expected anyone to examine. But who would do that? Who would go to that kind of expense and legal risk to eliminate federal jurisdiction over a piece of abandoned lakefront property? The answer was sitting right there in the HOA financial records on the signature line of the invoice approval form. Board President Authorization for Emergency Environmental Protection Measures. Signed by Ava White. The next morning brought another call from Danny Morrison at the Army Corps. Mr. Lewis, we've reviewed Inspector Torres' report about artificial waterway obstruction. This changes our survey timeline. We'll be out Thursday morning to document current conditions and determine impact on navigable status. Fair warning, if someone deliberately blocked a federal waterway, that's a whole different category of violation. Thursday morning, federal survey team, artificial obstruction documented by county inspector, financial records proving deliberate construction, and Ava White's signature on the authorization form for emergency environmental protection measures that look suspiciously like intentional destruction of federal waterway infrastructure. I spent Wednesday evening organizing my evidence files, printing copies of everything, and preparing for what felt like the most important meeting of my retirement. The rusted sign from day one, the Army Corps case number, Inspector Torres violation report, the HOA financial records GPS coordinates, and time-stamped video of the artificial dam. Everything documented, everything cross-referenced, everything ready for federal review. But there was one more piece of evidence I hadn't expected to find. Buried in the back pages of the Greenscape Solutions invoice was a detailed work order that described exactly what had been constructed and why. Block seasonal flow channel to eliminate federal navigation designation. Customer requests permanent elimination of core jurisdiction over private lake property. Signed by the contractor, approved by the customer, dated September 15th. $3,000 to destroy federal waterway status. Professional contractor hired to eliminate Army Corps jurisdiction. Work order that specifically stated the intention to break federal connection. All of it authorized by the HOA president, who was now threatening me with federal environmental violations for trying to restore the waterway connection that she had paid to destroy. The invoice from Greenscape Solutions was the smoking gun. Same date as the artificial dam construction. Same project that Inspector Torres had documented as illegal waterway modification. But there was one more detail buried in that work order, one more piece of evidence that was going to make Thursday's federal survey very interesting. The artificial dam hadn't been built to protect the environment. It had been built to eliminate federal oversight, and now I had the paperwork to prove it. The state environmental hearing room held exactly 153 people, and I'm pretty sure 140 of them wanted to see me lose. Local media had picked up the story, retiree versus environmental law, lake restoration, or wetland destruction, which meant cameras, reporters, and the kind of public attention that makes you understand why politicians always look uncomfortable. Ava didn't bother with screens this time. She ran the room like a litigator, sliding numbered exhibits across to the clerk, and walking Dr. Patricia Wells through tight leading questions that boxed me into a narrative of reckless disturbance. Photos became stabilization loss tire piles, became substrate disruption, and my inlet cleanup was recast as unauthorized barrier removal with downstream turbidity risk. It sounded airtight, especially with the professor calmly translating mud and cattails into liabilities. The respondents' actions represent a clear pattern of environmental disregard. Dr. Wells testified, referring to aerial photographs that showed every disturbed patch of mud around my property. Removal of stabilizing vegetation, disruption of sediment layers, and elimination of natural flow barriers can have cascading effects throughout the connected waterway system. This type of unauthorized modification is precisely what federal and state environmental statutes are designed to prevent. The administrative law judge, Elizabeth Kowalski, listened with the kind of professional attention that made me realize how seriously the state takes environmental violations. Inspector Torres took the stand, and in 2 clean paragraphs confirmed 2 facts the judge cared about: an obstruction existed before my work, and any alteration theirs or mine needed state paperwork I didn't have. Jurisdiction questions weren't on today's menu. My turn to present evidence felt like amateur hour. I had Inspector Torres's report about artificial obstruction, the HOA financial records showing the Greenscape Solutions invoice, and documentation of my Army Corps case number. But when I tried to explain the federal jurisdiction issue, Judge Kowalski cut me off politely but firmly. Mr. Lewis, this hearing addresses state environmental statute violations. Federal jurisdiction questions are outside the scope of today's proceedings. That's when I realized how thoroughly I'd been outmaneuvered. Ava had framed the entire dispute in terms of state environmental law, where her Clean Water Act citations were absolutely relevant and my federal jurisdiction claims were irrelevant. State law required permits for wetland modification. I hadn't obtained state permits. Therefore, I was in violation of state environmental statutes. Simple, clean, legally bulletproof. The evidence about artificial obstruction actually worked against me. Inspector Torres testified that someone had indeed built an unauthorized dam across the Waterway channel, but his recommendation was that both the dam and my subsequent modification work were violations that needed to be addressed through proper permit procedures. The fact that someone else had violated the law first didn't give me permission to violate it second. Mr. Lewis appears to have good intentions, Inspector Torres said during cross-examination, but good intentions don't replace proper environmental permitting. Whether we're talking about unauthorized dam construction or unauthorized dam removal, both activities require state approval when they affect waterway flow patterns. Judge Kowalski's preliminary ruling was exactly what I'd been dreading. Temporary cease and desist order pending full environmental assessment and proper permit application. The respondent will halt all activities affecting the waterway pending resolution of state environmental compliance issues. She looked directly at me with what might have been sympathy. Mr. Lewis, I understand your frustration with what appears to be prior unauthorized work on this property, but state environmental law doesn't provide exceptions for correcting other people's violations. The room was buzzing with that particular sound of vindicated neighbors who'd been proven right about the troublemaker in their midst. Ava was packing up her presentation materials with the satisfied efficiency of someone who'd just won a significant victory. Local media was already writing headlines about environmental law enforcement and the importance of protecting sensitive wetlands from individual property owners who thought rules didn't apply to them. But here's what nobody in that hearing room knew, what Judge Kowalski couldn't have anticipated, what even Ava White, with all her environmental law research, had missed. Federal agencies work on their own timeline, follow their own procedures, and don't particularly care about state administrative hearings when federal jurisdiction is involved. Thursday morning's Army Corps survey had happened exactly as Danny Morrison promised. Federal team, federal equipment, federal documentation of current waterway conditions. I hadn't mentioned it during the state hearing because it seemed irrelevant to Judge Kowalski's focus on state permit violations. But while we were arguing about state environmental law in a packed hearing room, the federal government was making its own determination about waterway jurisdiction. The email had arrived that morning at 6:47 a.m., 43 minutes before I walked into the state hearing room to face Judge Kowalski's preliminary ruling. Subject jurisdictional determination, property ID 779946, from Danny Morrison, Norfolk District Army Corps of Engineers. Official letterhead, case number reference, and language that was going to change everything about my little property dispute. Standing outside the hearing room after Judge Kowalski's cease and desist order, watching neighbors file past with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity, I realized that state environmental law and federal environmental law weren't necessarily the same thing. State agencies could issue cease and desist orders based on state permit violations, but if the waterway in question was under federal jurisdiction, then federal agencies had primary authority over permit requirements. During the recess, I asked the clerk for a hard copy of anything the Corps had sent that morning and walked into the hallway with a manila envelope and the kind of dread that makes your fingers feel clumsy. I slid out the letter, steadied my breath, and read under the humming lights. The Norfolk District confirmed seasonal navigability under Section 10, laid out the permit classes that would govern a restoration, set a 30-day site schedule, and flagged prior obstructions for enforcement review. Different rules. different referees. By the time I reached the last paragraph, it was clear the ground had shifted from state procedure to Federal Navigation Authority, and my next moves would be measured in core checklists, not HOA talking points. Federal jurisdiction wasn't a rumor anymore. It was the rulebook on the table. Restoration would run through core permits, not state forms, and any misstep would be measured against navigation law, not the citations Ava had brandished. Same mud, different authority, and a clear path that pointed away from HOA speeches and straight through federal checklists. But I had 48 hours to figure out what that email actually meant and whether federal jurisdiction trumped state cease and desist orders. 48 hours to turn a devastating legal defeat into something that might possibly look like vindication. The email from Danny Morrison had a subject line that was going to make the next HOA meeting very interesting. The emergency HOA meeting drew exactly 12 people, which tells you everything about how confident Ava had become after Thursday's state hearing. Board members, a few diehard neighbors who never missed meetings, and me, carrying a manila folder that contained either complete vindication or the final nail in my property ownership coffin. Ava called the meeting to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who just scored a major legal victory. The purpose of tonight's session is to discuss implementation of Judge Kowalski's cease and desist order and establish ongoing compliance monitoring for the Lewis property. She had prepared another presentation, this one focused on HOA enforcement mechanisms and community oversight procedures for environmental violators. State environmental law is clear. She continued clicking through slides about wetland protection and permit requirements. Mr. Lewis has received official state ruling requiring cessation of all waterway modification activities. The HOA board needs to establish protocols for ensuring compliance and preventing future violations that could affect our entire community. Rebecca Clark raised her hand. Ava, before we get into enforcement procedures, I think Logan has something he wants to share with the board. Mrs. Clark had been around long enough to recognize the look of someone who'd been holding on to important information, and she was giving me the opening I needed. I stood up and pulled out the printed email from Danny Morrison. Thank you, Mrs. Clark. I received this communication from the Army Corps of Engineers, Norfolk District, yesterday morning. The room went quiet with the particular attention people pay when someone mentions federal agencies. I'd like to read the relevant sections. I didn't read letters. I laid out a one-page summary. The board could act on core jurisdiction, confirmed under Section 10. Restoration and maintenance fall under federal permits. Prior barriers count as navigation obstructions. And the penalty exposure for continued interference is calculated daily until removal. The room didn't need prose. It needed consequences timelines and a contact name at Norfolk. The silence that followed was the kind of complete quiet you get when information that changes everything gets introduced into a room full of people who thought they knew everything. Ava's confident presentation rhythm faltered for the first time since I'd met her. Previous unauthorized obstruction of this navigation channel has been documented by county inspection services. I continued reading. Construction of artificial barriers across federal waterways constitutes violation of federal navigation law under 33 U.S.C. 403. Property owner is advised to coordinate restoration activities through proper federal permit procedures. State environmental compliance may be superseded by Federal Navigation Authority in cases of jurisdictional overlap. Board member David Clark spoke first. Logan, what exactly does that mean in practical terms? Good question, and I'd spent most of Thursday night researching the answer. It means the waterway on my property is under federal jurisdiction, not state jurisdiction. The cease and desist order from Judge Kowalski applies to state environmental violations, but if the Army Corps has primary authority over navigation issues, then state orders might not be binding for federal navigation work. I looked directly at Ava, who was staring at the email printout like it contained personally offensive information. More importantly, I continued, it means the artificial dam that Inspector Torres documented, the one built by Greenscape Solutions, according to HOA financial records, was a federal violation. Building unauthorized barriers across federal navigation channels carries penalties of up to $25,000 per day until the obstruction is removed. Ava found her voice, but it had lost the confident authority that had dominated every previous interaction. That changes the compliance framework considerably. She was reading through her own notes, probably looking for references to federal navigation law that weren't there. The environmental protection work authorized by this board was intended to preserve wetland integrity. By blocking a federal waterway, I said, not unkindly, but very clearly. The Greenscape Solutions work order specifically states the intention to eliminate federal navigation designation and block seasonal flow channel. That's not environmental protection, Ava. That's federal navigation obstruction. Board Treasurer Maria Santos was looking through her copy of the HOA financial records. The invoice was approved as emergency environmental protection. If the work was actually federal violation, we need to address liability issues immediately. She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. The HOA had authorized and paid for work that was now documented as federal law violation. What happened next was probably the most civilized surrender I've ever witnessed. No shouting, no accusations, no dramatic confrontations, just the quiet recognition that the legal landscape had shifted completely, and continuing to fight would only make things worse for everyone involved. "Mr. Lewis," Ava said after several minutes of board consultation, "what do you need from the HOA to resolve federal compliance issues?" It was a good question professionally asked by someone who'd realized that antagonizing the federal government was worse than accommodating one neighbor's lake restoration project. "I need a non-interference covenant," I said, pulling out the document I'd prepared after consulting with an attorney who specialized in federal waterway law. "Written agreement that the HOA will not obstruct federal navigation restoration work, will not challenge Army Corps permit decisions, and will coordinate any future waterway modifications through proper federal channels." We didn't stage a roll call drama. The Secretary circulated the non-interference covenant for signature under an emergency resolution already authorized by the bylaws. One by one, pens hit paper. The notarization took 5 minutes. The county e-recording, another 10. It was the quietest hard stop I've ever seen. We stepped outside for the notary photo. Behind us, I planted the rusted plate on an easel and clipped a fresh laminated tag, Federal Waterway Active Jurisdiction. The camera flash popped. Ava blinked, then squared her shoulders for the lens. Public documented archived. But here's what surprised me about that meeting, what I hadn't expected from my months of bureaucratic warfare with Ava White. She apologized. Not a dramatic emotional apology, but a professional acknowledgement that she'd been wrong about jurisdictional authority. "Logan, I was incorrect about navigation jurisdiction. Your approach to federal permit procedures was proper." She gathered her presentation materials with the careful dignity of someone who'd just learned an expensive lesson about researching all applicable law, not just the law that supported her position. I focused on state environmental statutes without adequately investigating federal navigation authority. I appreciate that, Ava, and I want to be clear. Environmental protection is absolutely important. The Army Corps permit process includes environmental review, impact assessment, and restoration requirements. I'm not trying to avoid environmental compliance. I'm just trying to work with the agency that actually has jurisdiction over this waterway. The meeting ended in cooperation board support for Corps permits and a commitment to root future issues through federal procedures. Walking home that night with the covenant and a fresh case log, I kept replaying the steps that actually moved the needle document. The channel trigger the federal file surfaced the paper trail and convert it into an enforceable promise. The argument had never been about who cared more, it was about routing the work to the only office that could lawfully order it. Once the pathway was correct, the noise dropped out. The next phase wouldn't be about speeches or votes, it would be schedules, inspections, and a punch list no one could ignore. Saturday looked like a field lab: cones, clipboards, high-vis vests. The Corps set a shoulder-high tripod sign at the path, "Jurisdictional Restoration in Progress, U.S. Army Corps." Neighbors took selfies under it before pulling on gloves. 23 of them came ready to fix what we'd spent months arguing about. The Army Corps representative arrived at 9 sharp. Not Danny Morrison, but his field supervisor, Janet Smith, who brought official documentation, professional photography equipment, and the kind of methodical thoroughness that federal agencies are famous for. She wasn't there to supervise the work, just to document current conditions and confirm that restoration activities were proceeding according to federal permit requirements. "This is impressive community response," Smith said, watching neighbors work, while I logged the morning's checklist. "For the record, your permit conditions require a stabilized channel profile by week 4, invasive control verified at 2 growth cycles, and quarterly photo sets from the same GPS pins for a year. Keep that cadence and we'll close on schedule." The The same neighbors who'd once voted me down were now helping me hit deadlines only a federal sign-off could set. Mrs. Clark was leading the vegetation management team, showing younger neighbors how to clear invasive species without damaging native marsh plants. The trick is knowing what belongs and what doesn't, she explained, pulling up purple loosestrife that had been choking out cattails for years. Just because something's growing doesn't mean it should be there. Good advice for invasive plants, and probably good advice for neighborhood disputes, too. The artificial dam removal had taken most of Friday with Inspector Torres supervising to ensure proper disposal of the constructed materials. What we found underneath was encouraging. The original channel was intact, just blocked by engineered obstruction. Clear evidence that someone had understood exactly what they were destroying when they authorized the Greenscape Solutions work. We laid the last beam on a blue tarp. Janet raised a red tag and read aloud for the GoPro obstruction logged and removed under federal authority, 33 U.S.C. A403. Applause cracked across the cattails. Not loud, satisfying. Rebecca Clark David's wife was helping with water quality testing when she asked the question everyone had been thinking about. Logan, what happens if we get another HOA president who decides federal permits don't matter? Legitimate concern, and one that the non-interference covenant was designed to address, but it highlighted the broader issue of how communities deal with federal jurisdiction questions. That's why documentation matters, I said, showing her the laminated copies of the Army Corps determination that would be posted at the property markers. Federal jurisdiction doesn't depend on local opinion. It's based on navigable connection, seasonal flow patterns, and waterway connectivity that gets measured and documented by federal agencies. Personal feelings about federal authority don't change hydrological reality. So the morning's work was interrupted by something I hadn't expected. Ava White walking down the path from the street carrying coffee and what looked like a handwritten note. The conversation stopped with that particular awkwardness that happens when someone shows up at a gathering they weren't exactly invited to, but probably should have been. Ava came down the path with a thermal carafe and a stack of paper cups, set them on the sawhorse, and asked who needed caffeine and who needed clipboards. She didn't give a speech. Instead, she scanned the whiteboard, read the task list, and said she could take the shoreline crews that were logging vegetation, plus the permit log that tracked what had to be photographed for the Corps. Mrs. Clark passed her a pair of gloves and a laminated map with GPS pins. Ava nodded, clipped the map to a board, and started assigning pairs like she'd run workdays her whole life. She handed me a folded page with neat bullet points. It wasn't an apology. It was a to-do chain quarterly photo sets from fixed pins, invasive pulls at 2 growth cycles, signage updates on the public path to show federal permit numbers, and a draft outline for homeowner workshops on when to call the county, when to call the Corps, and what documents to save. If I can get the library room on Thursdays, the note ended, I'll run the sessions and bring in a wetlands biologist for Q&A. Between assignments, she walked the channel with Janet's conditions printout and matched each requirement to a job who was logging turbidity, who was measuring cross-section, who was bagging hardware from the obstruction for the file. When neighbors asked where to start, she pointed to the checklist and kept the line moving. By the time the carafe ran dry, the board had more check marks than blank boxes, and the day finally felt like it was running on a schedule instead of adrenaline. Smith looked up from her documentation work. That's correct. Federal navigation permits include mandatory environmental impact assessment, public comment periods, and ongoing monitoring requirements. For waterways with seasonal connectivity to federal navigation channels, Corps permits provide comprehensive environmental oversight. The rest of the morning proceeded with the kind of productive cooperation that makes community work days satisfying instead of frustrating. Invasive species, removal debris, clearing water quality, documentation, and establishment of monitoring protocols that would satisfy both federal permit requirements and neighborhood environmental concerns. But the most important work wasn't physical restoration. It was the conversation that developed between neighbors who'd been on opposite sides of a legal dispute that had escalated beyond anyone's intentions. Jim Peterson, who had been worried about property values, realized that federal navigation designation might actually increase property values by ensuring waterway access and environmental protection. Maria Santos learned that federal environmental compliance could be more rigorous than state regulations, not less. David Clark discovered that working with federal agencies wasn't the bureaucratic nightmare he'd expected. Ava spent most of the afternoon working with Mrs. Clark on native plant restoration, and I overheard parts of their conversation about community environmental education. We should have monthly workshops about federal. and state environmental law, Ava was saying. Understanding jurisdictional authority, permit requirements, and proper procedures for property owners who want to do restoration work. By late afternoon, the waterway looked better than it had in years. Clear channel documented flow patterns, invasive species controlled, and debris removed under proper federal oversight. More importantly, the neighborhood had worked through a legal dispute that could have turned into years of litigation and hostility. Janet Smith completed her documentation with the professional satisfaction of someone whose job involves turning bureaucratic confusion into regulatory clarity. "This is how federal navigation restoration is supposed to work," she said, reviewing photographs and water level data that would become part of the permanent Army Corps record. Community cooperation, proper procedures, and environmental compliance through appropriate federal channels. Walking home that evening, carrying tools and muddy boots and the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from productive physical work, I realized something about neighborhood conflicts and federal law. The legal system works best when people understand which authority has jurisdiction over which issues and when communities work together to comply with applicable regulations instead of fighting about whether those regulations should exist. Ava's apology wasn't just about admitting jurisdictional mistakes. It was about recognizing that environmental protection and property rights aren't necessarily in conflict. They just need to be balanced through proper legal procedures and appropriate regulatory oversight. But there was one final lesson from that rusted sign, one last piece of wisdom that would help other homeowners avoid the jurisdictional confusion that had nearly destroyed my retirement project. 6 months later, my little lake had become something of a case study in federal-local cooperation, and I'd accidentally become the neighborhood expert on waterway jurisdiction questions. 3 other property owners had contacted me about similar issues: seasonal streams, artificial modifications, and confused authority questions that could have turned into expensive legal battles if not handled through proper channels. The one-page handbook started as a joke. Logan's Guide to Not Getting Sued by Federal Agencies was what Rebecca Harris called it when I mentioned documenting the procedures I'd learned through trial and bureaucratic error. But when the county extension office asked for permission to distribute it as an educational resource, the joke became a genuinely useful reference document for rural property owners dealing with waterway questions. 3 questions that save your property: who authorized what scope, where's the paperwork? The handbook opened with the same framework that had guided me through months of jurisdictional confusion. Simple questions that help property owners identify which agencies have authority over which activities and how to determine proper permit requirements before starting work that might affect waterways. The county plat records had been updated to reflect the federal navigation designation, which meant future property owners would know about Army Corps' jurisdiction before purchasing lakefront land. No more surprises about federal authority, no more assumptions about state versus federal permit requirements, no more expensive mistakes based on incomplete regulatory research. HOA training had become mandatory, not punishment for past mistakes, but practical education about how federal agencies interact with local communities. Monthly sessions covering topics like when to call which agency, understanding jurisdictional overlap, and environmental compliance through proper channels. Ava had volunteered to coordinate the program using her experience with environmental law research to help neighbors avoid the regulatory confusion we'd all learned to navigate. The practical impact extended beyond our neighborhood. Inspector Torres started including federal jurisdiction questions in his standard waterway assessment procedures. Logan's case taught us that county inspectors need to understand federal navigation law, not just state environmental regulations, he explained during a watershed management workshop. We were documenting violations without understanding which authority had primary jurisdiction. Danny Morrison from the Army Corps had become something of a regular visitor, not because of ongoing compliance issues, but because our restoration project had become a model for community federal cooperation. "This is how navigation restoration should work," he said during the 6-month follow-up survey. Property owner initiates proper procedures, community provides support, federal agency provides oversight, and everyone benefits from improved waterway management. The kids from the neighborhood had adopted the staff gauge as their unofficial water level monitoring station. Every morning before school, someone would check the measurement and record it in the waterproof logbook that Mrs. Clark had installed in a weatherproof container. Scientific data collection had become a community education project, and children were learning about seasonal water flow patterns, precipitation effects, and the relationship between local rainfall and regional waterway connectivity. But the most satisfying result was watching other property owners successfully navigate similar jurisdictional questions without months of legal confusion. Tom Bradley, whose creek property 3 miles downstream had been damaged by unauthorized dam construction, used the handbook procedures to identify Army Corps' authority and resolve his restoration project through proper federal channels. Sarah learned about seasonal wetland regulations before purchasing marshy property, avoiding the permit confusion that could have delayed her conservation project. The 3-question framework had proven surprisingly robust for different types of waterway issues. Who authorized helped property owners determine whether previous modifications had been done with proper permits. What scope clarified which activities required, which types of permits from which agencies. Where's the paperwork ensured that claims about regulatory authority could be verified through official documentation. Legal authority, it turned out, wasn't about who sounded most confident or who could cite the most impressive-sounding statutes. It was about understanding which agencies had been granted jurisdiction over which activities by federal and state law and working through proper procedures with the appropriate authorities. The afternoon sun was slanting through the cattails, turning the restored waterway into something that looked almost magical after months of careful maintenance and gradual ecological recovery. Native vegetation was returning, water quality had improved significantly, and the seasonal connection to the Willow River was functioning exactly as federal navigation law intended. Janet Smith filed a final report to Norfolk, recommending our project as a template for similar restorations. Standing by the staff gauge that had started as an emergency measurement tool and evolved into a permanent community monitoring station, I realized something about the relationship between individual property rights and collective regulatory responsibility. Federal law wasn't designed to prevent property owners from improving their land. It was designed to ensure that individual improvements didn't damage shared waterway resources that affect entire watersheds. The rusted sign that had started this whole journey was now displayed in a weatherproof case next to the staff gauge, with explanatory text about how federal navigation designations work and why they matter for waterway connectivity. Historical artifact, legal evidence, and educational tool all in one corroded piece of metal that had nearly been thrown away as worthless junk. Ava stopped by most evenings during her neighborhood walks, not to check on compliance or monitor activities, but to see how the native plant restoration was progressing and discuss ideas for expanding environmental education throughout the community. We'd discovered that federal environmental compliance and community environmental stewardship were mutually supporting goals, not competing priorities. "You know what I learned from this whole experience?" she said during one of our evening conversations about watershed management and community cooperation. "Environmental protection works better when everyone understands the legal framework instead of just assuming that good intentions are sufficient." She was right, and her observation highlighted something important about the relationship between law and environmental stewardship. Regulations exist to protect shared resources, but they work best when communities understand the procedures and cooperate with oversight agencies instead of fighting about whether oversight should exist. The final lesson from my accidental education in federal waterway law was simple but important. The legal system works when people use it properly, and it fails when people ignore proper procedures or assume that personal knowledge is sufficient for complex regulatory questions. 3 questions: who authorized what scope, where's the paperwork, could save property owners from months of expensive confusion and help communities work with federal agencies instead of against them. If you have a piece of water that connects seasonally to larger waterway systems, start with GPS-tagged photographs and a polite email to the appropriate federal office. Document everything, follow proper procedures, and remember that environmental protection and property rights aren't enemies. They're both served by understanding which authority has jurisdiction over which activities. The law doesn't shout, it just files paperwork properly and opens doors.